I think.
For those, again, this is another gentleman who doesn't need introduction, but Lord Turner is here in his role as the chair of the Energy Transition Commission. He has had several other very distinguished roles in the past, including the chair of the Financial Services Authority in the UK at the eve, just after the crisis. You were appointed in October, I believe, October of 2008. But I shall let him take over, and we've been promised fireworks, and then we begin. 15 minutes, please.
Well, I really do want this slide for a reason that will become apparent. Where is the clicker around somewhere?
Yes, there.
Are you going to be able to get the slides to work? Does it go forward from here? What? Are we? There we go. Okay. Thank you very much. Well, look, we've been asked to talk about the next decade, but I want to start with a somewhat longer perspective. Sometime between about 1.5 million years ago and 500,000 years ago, humankind, or at least it might be better to say pre-humankind, Homo erectus, worked out how to use fire. How to use fire as a source of warmth, how to use fire to cook with, and how to use fire to drive animals out of forests so that you should kill them. Now, historians are not quite clear as to which specific human being, man or woman, played the major role in this. But I think since it was an incredibly difficult challenge to do it, it must be clear that it could only have been done by somebody who, as Klaus Zumwinkel put it, had spent years producing thousands of exhibits in the then vibrant McKinsey offices in Germany, but who moved, so historians believe, to set up a small tribe known as the tribe of Systemique, who are the ones who created fire. This breakthrough of fire was absolutely fundamental. And it was actually fundamental not just to economic growth, but to us as human beings. Because fire enabled cooking, and that meant that we could eat cooked food, and we can digest cooked food far faster, and we can produce calories far faster. And we would not have been able to grow the brains that we have today if we did not have cooked food. Without the energy of fire, none of us would be the human beings that we are today. And of course, that led on to everything else that human intelligence has been able to create, to agriculture, to domestication, and indeed to the social aspects. And I'm going to come back to this, the social ability to interchange, which based on language, to have an emotional affiliation, and to form wider and wider political groupings in which we can agree on things on a collective basis. So fire and energy was absolutely fundamental. But what is striking is that it's only in the last 300 years, the last 3 centuries, that our ability to progress seems to have become relentless and limited. Despite our ability of bigger and bigger brains, despite becoming modern Homo sapiens, despite our cognitive abilities and our technologies, up until about 300 years ago, there was no necessary process of technological progress or of economic growth. Indeed, there were long periods of time where, as best as we can tell, there was no economic growth at all. There was an agricultural revolution which started back in northern Mesopotamia, the Fertile Crescent, about 8,000 years ago with the domestication of animals and of plants. But what's interesting is that most historians believe that once that had occurred, it unleashed such a large population growth that at the end of that process, the standard of living was no higher than it was under hunter-gatherers. Indeed, there are many historians who believe that effectively the life of a peasant of the ancient world was considerably worse than that of the hunter-gatherer in terms of how hard they had to work in order to enjoy a certain standard of living defined in fundamental terms. And if we then switch to the last 2,000 years, there's been a remarkable study by a man called Angus Madison, which tried to understand as best we can, using this modern measure of GDP, what was GDP per capita throughout that 2,000 years? And as best Madison can work out, from the year 0 to the year 1000, there was no increase at all. The GDP per capita of the world was flat at about $400 to $500 per capita, about the level of some of the poorest countries in Africa today. And it was only at a slow process after 1000, and then at an increasing pace after 1500, that the Western European area, and what Madison calls the offshoots of Western Europe, in particular the US, began to grow away. And the reason why they began to grow away and achieve at last a sustained increase in that per capita GDP had a lot to do with energy. In 1500, in England, average energy use per capita, as best we can work out, was about 20 gigajoules per person, which is actually only about a third less than in India today, in India where most people, as Sonny said, don't have access to electricity. But of that 20 gigajoules, it's interesting to see where it came from, because almost none came from what we currently think of as an energy source. About a quarter was human work. We ingested food, that gave us energy. We were able to plow fields and dig things and build things ourselves. About a third was draft animals, horses and cows, which we used to plow. About a third was wood, traditional biomass, and then there was a small amount of wind and water. But there was almost no fossil fuels. But that then began to change between 1500 and 1700. And by 1700, energy use in the UK had gone up to about 30 gigajoules per capita, and all of that increase was one thing: coal. And that coal was absolutely fundamental to the revolution which occurred in our standard of living, which then produced this extraordinary takeoff of the standard of living of, first of all, Western Europe and its offshoots, and then the rest of the world, an increase which we had never seen before. Now, it's worth pondering, why did that initial increase between 1500 and 1700 occur? And part of the story is that necessity was the mother of innovation, because Britain was beginning to run out of wood. It was becoming a naval nation, and it was chopping down a lot of wood to build ships to travel the world to the new parts of the world which were being discovered. It had a growing population, and that growing population was encroaching on its forests. And it was turning more of its forests into charcoal in order to make iron and steel in an environment where there was an increasing amount of iron consumption. And the net result was that the woodlands were being depleted, and they were being depleted to a level where the price of wood was going up, and there was an incentive to find coal and to use it. And fortunately for Britain, there were enormous amounts of reserves there. But once they began to use coal, the great thing about it was not only that it was hugely abundant, but it also had some great advantages, the great advantage of density. This is wood. Wood has about 4 kilowatt hours per kilogram of weight. Coal has about 8 kilowatt hours per kilogram of weight. But it is also denser per cubic meter, or per volume. And the net effect is that in terms of volume, this is about 3 times as dense, or 3 or 4 times as dense as wood. And that made it possible to build the blast furnaces of the Industrial Revolution and to drive the initial steam-driven factories in a way that we would never have been able to do with wood alone. And that then, of course, led on to this growth, which was fundamentally driven by energy. Initially by coal, and then from about 1900, but increasingly from about 1940s onwards, by crude oil and natural gas. And crude oil and natural gas, which of course gets turned into this bottle of gasoline, which I have in front of me now, is even better in terms of energy density. We're talking 12 kilowatt hours per kilogram. And it also has the fantastic benefit that it's easy to use, because it's incredibly flammable. Unlike with coal, where if I was to try to burn it, it would be quite difficult to get it going. Well, even if my lighter worked, it would be quite difficult to get it going. There we are. With this gasoline, it would be quite easy, and I could blow us all up if it wasn't apple juice, and I need a bit of a glass now. But so density and flammability drove the extraordinary role of oil and then gas. And energy has been the very basis of the standard of living that we've achieved. It's the very basis of the growth, and it's the very basis of the extraordinary differences in material consumption which we see across the world. So in the world of America, with its large SUVs and its enormous fridges, to run that, they need about 290 gigajoules per capita per year. Here in Europe, we're a bit more efficient and a bit more abstemious, and we're at about 130 gigajoules per capita, and in India, it's 28 gigajoules per capita. We cannot have prosperity without, even if we are as efficient as possible, huge use of energy, and we cannot make India as prosperous as we are without significant increasing its energy demand. So energy has been fundamental, but it has come at a huge environmental cost about which Nick spoke. And we are now on a path of emissions which, if we do not stop, if we do not reverse, as Nick has said, almost immediately, then we are going to do serious harm to the world's ecology. We are now at something like 40 gigatons, 45 gigatons, of which about 35 gigatons are coming from the energy system. And within the energy system, we have to get that down to 20 gigatons by 2040, and we have to get it down to net zero by 2070, or we have no hope whatsoever of meeting the climate change agreements in the Paris Agreement. So we face an enormous challenge. How do we increase the energy used by countries like India or Africa, which are still far short of our standards of living, while doing it in a zero carbon, a low carbon, and a zero carbon fashion? Well, the good news is that it is technologically possible. And if there's one fundamental reason why it will ultimately be completely technological possible, it's this. We have, a few million miles away, an enormous nuclear power station which sends us completely safely every day 8,000 times as much energy as we currently use for our energy system. So we only have to capture a minute fraction of that, and we will be able to have a completely clean system, either captured directly from the sun or captured from the wind, which is, of course, simply an indirect product of the energy from the sun. The good news is that we increasingly know how to do that. We know how dramatically to reduce the cost of solar energy. The cost of a silicon PV cell is now 1/200th of what it was in 1977, because human ingenuity, plus important public policy support, plus the scale development of a massive industry across the world, has driven this dramatic reduction in cost. And that, of course, has meant a reduction in the price of electricity which solar PV cells can deliver. I was the first chair of the UK's Climate Change Committee back in 2008. This is the committee charged by our Act of Parliament to make sure that we reduce our emissions by 80% by 2050. And back in 2008, we did some analysis as to what we thought would happen to the future price of solar and wind. I have to say that I hope somebody has destroyed the documents that we then produced because they were so embarrassingly conservative. We knew that the price of solar and wind would come down, but my memory was we thought that maybe by 2020 it would be down 25 or 30%. But actually, even compared with 2008, the cost of solar PV electricity is down 85%, the cost of wind is down 65%, And as Nick showed on those auctions which he showed, the price is continuing to come down even more. We are seeing, admittedly in the most favorable sunny parts of the world, auctions for solar PV electricity at below 2 cents per kilowatt hour. And let me make a prediction. Within the next 5 years, in some of the sunny parts of the world, we will see solar PV auctions being won at less than 1 cent per kilowatt hour. This is a hugely, hugely optimistic point of view. But the question, of course, that you have to ask is, but what do you do when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow? And that's the central question that we've been asking in the work of the Energy Transition Commission, which I chair and which Systemic supports. We've been trying to work out how do you build a near-total renewable system, something which is 85 or 90% based on intermittent renewables. And we're convinced it's completely possible, partly because, and Nick has already shown this chart as well, the dramatically falling cost of batteries. Batteries which mean that by the mid-2020s, an electric car will be cheaper than an internal combustion engine car in its upfront capital cost, let alone its through the life cycle cost of running, but which also enable us to think about using batteries in the utility system. And that will mean that along with using gas turbines as peaker plants, we are absolutely convinced in the ETC that by the early 2030s, and we produced this last year, that we will be able to deliver all in 24/7 electricity whenever you want it at a cost of below 7 cents per kilowatt hour, which is below the cost of fossil fuels. And we will be able to do that not just in the sunniest parts of the world, but throughout the world. And I have a prediction about that forecast as well, which is that in about 5 years' time, I'm going to be embarrassed about its conservatism, as well as the ones that I made in the past. So we have the ability to decarbonize our electricity supply. And once we've done that, we can decarbonize our auto system, our car system. We can decarbonize electric heat. And we can even decarbonize what we used to think were some of the hard-to-abate sectors, like steel, cement, chemicals, aviation, shipping, and trucking, on which within the Energy Transition Commission we're working at the moment. You can make steel without coking coal or without charcoal. You can make it using hydrogen as a reduction agent. In ships, we want a fuel which will drop into the existing engines run on heavy fuel oil, because engines run a hell of a long time. But that could be ammonia. Ammonia produced from hydrogen, which if we are producing it from electrolysis, will be completely clean. As for aviation, aviation is the one area where we are probably always going to need a liquid hydrocarbon, because these things are a bit heavier than these things. There is in this gasoline, and you well know that it is gasoline, the small amount of gasoline, probably about 3 times as much energy as there is in this rather heavy a battery to my side. And even if we produce quite fundamental improvements in battery technology, we will still not be able to get a plane across the Atlantic with a battery. We think you'd have to improve battery densities about 6 or 7 times from the current level before we could do it across the Atlantic. But we can make aviation hydrocarbon liquids synthesized from direct capture of CO2 from the air and from electrolysis of hydrogen. And we believe we can be able to do that at a reasonable cost. Indeed, the essence of the point is that once energy gets really cheap, once we have really cheap electricity, we can make almost anything from that, and at costs which are not exorbitant in terms of our standard of living. The calculation of how much more expensive steel will be if we go the hydrogen route rather than the coking coal route, maybe even at today's technology, $100 per ton. Well, a car weighs, an average car, about a ton. So the question is, are you willing to spend another $100 for your next car to make sure that it comes from completely green steel? I think we should be able to convince people that that is a reasonable thing to do. And for the aviation jet fuel at the current cost, that would probably add $80 to $100 for an economy class a flight to New York. Again, I don't think that's an impossible thing to ask people. And indeed, I'll make another prediction. Nick Stern, who's just had to leave, made a calculation in his report that the cost to the economy of dealing with climate, dealing with greenhouse gases, and building a low-carbon economy would be only 1.5% to 2% of GDP. I think we increasingly understand that that was far too conservative. Now, that means that we should be technologically optimistic. But does that mean that we can simply declare victory? I'm afraid no, because I think while we can be technologically extremely optimistic, oh, by the way, I forget to mention, this is hydrogen, except it's not hydrogen because it isn't floating high enough. But I forgot to mention that in our vision of the hydrogen economy, and for now just assume that this is hydrogen, if I make it float up, we can see a world in which we will use 6 or 7 times more hydrogen than we do at the moment, produced with 5 times as much electricity as we do at the moment, a completely different economy, but one which is capable of being zero carbon. So what worries me? What worries me is not the technological possibility, but 3 challenges, 3 social and political challenges. And the first one Nick has spoke to. It is we need to move very, very fast. If you asked me, am I certain that by 2070 or 2100 we could have a zero carbon economy, the answer is it is relatively easy to imagine that. If you ask, can we get those emissions falling dramatically within the next decade, that is much more difficult. Because when you go very fast, you're having to throw away some existing assets. When you go very fast, you're challenging some existing sources of profit or employment. When you go very fast, you've really got to work through not the end point, but how you manage on the transition from here to there. The second thing which is concerning is that the future of energy is very cheap. We are going to live in a world in which energy is going to get very cheap. And as a result, there is a danger that we will simply use energy in a more and more wasteful fashion. Economic theorists usually assume, free market theorists, that consumer demands, what people want, is a given. It's an exogenous fact. But actually, consumer demands are heavily influenced by social behavior, by competition by other people, and by advertisements. Have you ever thought about car advertisements? Advertisements for SUVs. There's an interesting point about car advertisements. There are never any other cars in the car advertisement. Car advertisements are uniquely made, shot in, I would guess, rural Sweden at about 4 a.m. on a June morning when you can be confident that there was going to be nobody else on the road. But they persuade people to then buy something where their predominant experience is going to be on the right-hand side, sitting bumper to bumper behind other people and wondering why they're getting so annoyed. One of the things that we have to think about is the behavioral economics of how we make sensible choices as a society on the way that we use the benefits of very cheap electricity and very cheap energy. And the other thing which is worrying is that if renewable energy is cheap, so too will fossil fuel energy. Suppose that by 2100 we live in a world where artificial intelligence has given us robots that can do almost anything. And suppose by then the price of solar electricity is 0.5 cent or 1/4 cent per kilowatt hour. Ask yourself, what will then be the cost of mining coal? It will be very, very low. And there is an enormous amount of coal in the world. We're not quite sure how much, but certainly it's over 5 times. If we burnt, it's certainly something like 1,500, I'm going to get my units wrong here. Well, it's a lot. We consume each year at the moment about 8 gigatons. I've got it right now. It's at least 1,500 gigatons. It's probably 2,000 gigatons. It's enough to go on consuming coal at the present level for the next 200 years. And if we burn that 2,000 gigatons, we will put into the atmosphere about 5,000 or 6,000 gigatons of CO2, which is at least 5 or 6 times the maximum that we can put out and still have any hope of staying well below 2 degrees centigrade. Our fundamental problem is that we have got to leave 3/4 of our coal, 3/4 of our gas, and probably a half of our oil in the ground, even if the price of getting it out will be so low that, despite renewables also being low, somebody will want to do it. Nick talked a little bit earlier about religion, about the Pope's attitude and the attitude of the Roman Catholic Church, which is displaying real leadership on the issue of climate change. But I think it's interesting to note that if only we could have a beneficent God who would send angels in the night to come and steal 3/4 of our fossil fuels, we could be absolutely confident that by 2070 or 80, we would have built a zero-carbon economy and at a cost to the economy which we would not even notice. Technologically, it's completely and utterly doable. But at least so far, our prayers have not been answered and those angels have not come in the night, and that means that we face a social and political challenge. A social and political challenge to make sure that we have the regulation, the carbon prices, the support for new technologies, which make sure that we head towards a zero-carbon economy, even though we have been left with huge amounts of fossil fuel. Unlike between 1,500 and 1,700 in the UK, we don't have the benefit that we're going to run out of the stuff which we're starting with. England ran out of wood. Unfortunately, we're not going to run out of fossil fuels. So we need to use those brains which have been given to us by the great inventor of fire many hundreds of thousands of years ago. We need to use them not merely to solve the technological problems, but even more to solve the problem of social and political coordination and agreement. And to do that, we need, as Nick said earlier, we need to argue the case continually for the policies that we need. We need to communicate it as clearly as possible. It's more difficult than the technology, but I'm still an optimist that we will get there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. May I thank you, everybody, for the applause on behalf of Lord Turner. But if I were you, I would question putting all my faith in a man whose hydrogen turns out to be helium and whose petrol turns out to be apple juice, with a pinch of salt. May I please invite Michael Meirer, who is working at the cusp of technology, academia, business, and consulting, and at the bottom-up end of the top-down picture that Lord Turner painted of actually looking at biofuels, bioenergy, and nutrients, which also reminds us about the intersection of the different discussions we are having today. This is not just about climate. This is not just about energy. This is about biodiversity. This is about nutrients. This is about the circular economy. This is about all of the above. And one of the huge, big runoffs we have is fertilizers, chemical fertilizers, which are also indirectly responsible for a lot of environmental damage. And this research, which is potentially scalable, I'm told, is going to address some of the energy problems and some of that simultaneously. Over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Kapoor. It's not very easy for me to speak after Lord Turner. It was an incredible experiment here. I thought about Science Slam here in Innsbruck in the Treibhaus Theater. So from a very global scale, I would like to come to Innsbruck, to Tyrol now with a very specific topic. I would like to talk about co-digestion on wastewater treatment plants and why we think some co-substrates are a problem. So what is co-digestion? On a wastewater treatment plant, most of the modern wastewater treatment plants use digesters, as we see here, to decrease the amount of sewage sludge and produce biogas as a byproduct, which is good. And if they add additional substrates, co-substrates, they can enhance the biogas yield and enhance the profit of the wastewater treatment plant. But there are some co-substrates we think are critical. And here I would like to quote Mr. Braungart. If you try to improve a bad situation or to try to do it perfect, you have to be careful that you don't do it perfectly wrong in the end. So we thought of disruption here. We thought of we need a complete new process, and I would like to explain it to you in one slide here. First, I would like to talk about the possibilities we have to treat separately collected organic waste. Of course, we can put it into a composting plant, produce a fertilizer, and use the nutrients afterwards on the agricultural fields. We could also produce biopolymers, bioplastic, biodegradable plastic, and have a resource use. But we think it would be best to put it into a biogas plant, compost it afterwards, so you get the biogas, biomethane, the renewable energy, and the fertilizer afterwards, so energy and the resource use. But what happens if we put this separately collected organic waste into the wastewater treatment plant? We get the energy use as well, we get the biogas, but we get troubles recycling or recovering the nutrients, because here in Tyrol, in Vienna, in Salzburg, it's already forbidden to put sewage sludge back on agricultural fields. You have to burn it. It's also forbidden, for example, in Switzerland. And in Austria, the Bundesabfallwirtschaftsplan already announced that in a couple of years it will be the case in whole Austria. So what do you have to do? We have to burn it, and it's not state-of-the-art. It's not possible to recover phosphorus and other nutrients at the moment, maybe in some years. But we think this is an environmental regression. So what did we do? We focused on the organic waste in the residual waste. We did sorting analysis for 2 to 3 years. It's not a funny work, I can tell you. It smells awful, it's very time-consuming, but you get very important data afterwards. And we found out that in Innsbruck we have about 18% of organic waste in the residual waste. This is bad if you think that we have a separate collection of organic waste here, but it's good if you compare it to Munich, for example, they have 36%. Then we crushed the residual waste in a coarse shredder, put it on a screen with 40 millimeters, and in this fraction we already had 47, 48, about 50% of organic waste. And we thought, okay, let's try to mechanically separate this organic waste in the residual waste and use this as a co-substrate. So what is the result? Of course, you are not allowed to put residual waste on the landfills anymore, or in most of European countries. Mechanical biological treatment plants are just an intermediate solution, we think. The state-of-the-art is the waste incineration. At the moment, residual waste and the organic waste in the residual waste is put into a waste incineration plant. You have the energy use, but it's nearly impossible to recover any nutrients. Maybe you can recover the metals of the slag, but not phosphorus, nitrogen, and other nutrients. And if it would be possible to put the organic waste of the residual waste in the wastewater treatment plant, maybe in some years we can recover the phosphorus, but the much bigger improvement would be that we get the bio-waste, the separately collected organic waste, back in the biogas plants. Because at the moment in Tyrol, wastewater treatment plants can take the bio-waste cheaper, and biogas plants get problems to get a substrate. And therefore, this is the way we think we should work with co-digestion in the future. And as a takeaway message from my side, take-home message, of course, we need renewable energy, but we also have to take care of the nutrients and in the end of the soil of Mother Earth. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Before we go to questions, I think sadly there's time for only one question. We're running a little bit behind. May I check if the chocolates have been delivered? Because I haven't got mine. And I asked a question too. We'll hold you to that. So is there one question from the audience, please? Going, gone. Okay, my question then, very quickly. So, in most of the discussions that we have on the energy transition, there's mostly a discussion about the price point. And the last note you ended on, I think, is often missed out, the quantitative side. So if we arrive at a point where, because solar energy is almost free, and fossil fuel energy becomes price competitive again, and this is often a yin and yang as they go together, will we need, from a policy perspective, hard quantitative limits rather than just price criteria on fossil fuels? Can we actually tackle and limit climate emissions without that hard quantitative limits, or actually even forbidding fossil fuel extraction altogether?
I was thinking earlier when you asked Nick what was the single most important thing, and he went for the One Belt, One Road. I still think it would be a carbon price. I mean, if we put a carbon price wedge between what the cost of the place, a tax essentially, on fossil fuels, then I think even in this race for the bottom, which I think is the long-term history of the way that energy prices are going to do, we can make sure that renewables, in all their characteristics, including the bioenergy as well as the solar, are always cheaper than the fossil fuels. I think we should also have a quantitative point of view. And I think the quantitative point of view should be that we have got to get rid of coal as fast as possible. I can see no scenario for the world getting to well below 2 degrees, which doesn't have total coal use down from about 8 gigatons today to, say, 2 gigatons by 2040, 2050. And if we're going to do that, it's going to take us somewhat longer to work out how to get rid of metallurgical coking coal than thermal coal. So that means thermal coal use for power generation has got to go down 90%. And given that we are not going to be able to switch off some of the Indian and Chinese power stations that already exist, that means that coal use for thermal power production in the developed world, in any country which is serious about it, has just got to stop as quickly as possible. Now, I'm very happy to say that last year, in about April, we had the first day in Britain where no coal was burnt in our power system. And in fact, we've now had the first sequence of 3 days, over the last 3 days, where no coal has been burnt. And by 2025, there will be no coal in the UK system whatsoever. And the one issue, well, I'm sure there are other ones as well, but the one area where I do think there is a role for a quantitative point of view is among any developed country which wants to believe that it is serious about dealing with climate change, has got to commit to getting coal out of its electricity system as rapidly as it possibly can.
And if you take the positive externality of that for the national health outcomes,
yeah,
that increases the case.
It increases the case for it as well.
Yeah. Yeah. So, Michael, how scalable is this proposal? If you were to be able to roll this out, what benefits would result both on the energy side and other positive environmental externalities?
So coal digestion on its own is a good process because you use the free capacities on the wastewater treatment plants, you use the infrastructure and use it as a biogas plant. But as I wanted to say, you have to be careful what co-substrate you choose. And for us, it's also a problem to go with this topic into public, because if we show the population that we are able to separate residual waste mechanically afterwards, they won't have they don't know why they should separate glass from paper from plastic and so on. So this would be the wrong message. Yeah. So you have to be very careful because the separately collected organic waste is worth very much if you put it into a biogas plant, and you should produce not very much residual waste because you can just burn it afterwards.
Understood. Thank you both very much.